Standing by my window in Alexandria, I watched the restless tide of evening traffic while questioning if my 3 years of constant financial sacrifice would ever be truly acknowledged. My name is Brianna, a 32-year-old cybersecurity engineer who has been quietly paying the mortgage and property taxes for a family that treats me like an inconvenient ghost. The fragile piece of our dynamic shattered when a notification popped up in our family group chat today. My younger sister Savannah sent a message explicitly banning me from her upcoming wedding by stating that her amazing ceremony was reserved for family only. The insult turned into a searing betrayal as I watched both mom and dad instantly react by liking her message without a single word of protest or defense. In a moment of absolute clarity, I realized that my worth to them was purely transactional, so I typed a response that would change everything. I congratulated her, while informing the entire group that the mortgage and taxes were now their sole responsibility, ending with a demand for the immediate return of my Tesla. Within 2 minutes, the entire chat was deleted as my screen became a chaotic blur of over 50 missed calls from the people who had just claimed I wasn't family. If you have ever been treated like a stranger by the very people you have spent years supporting, please share your story in the comments and subscribe to see how this high-stakes confrontation unfolds. Everything did not just turn sour overnight, because the roots of this exploitation actually stretched back 10 years to the moment I received my very first professional paycheck. I remember the oppressive heat of that summer afternoon, when my mother Martha sat me down at the kitchen table with a stack of legal documents that would alter the trajectory of my financial life forever. She insisted that I needed to sign as the primary guarantor for their new house in Alexandria, since my credit score was the only one in the family high enough to secure a decent interest rate. Martha gripped my hand tightly while claiming this was a necessary sacrifice for our collective future, yet she never mentioned that I would be the one left holding the bill if things went south. My father Walter just sat in the corner of the room staring at his coffee mug in total silence, while refusing to meet my eyes as the ink dried on those binding papers. That day set a dangerous precedent where my hard-earned stability became a safety net for their poor decisions, allowing Savannah to live a life of luxury she never actually earned. As the months turned into years, the blatant favoritism in our household became impossible to ignore, because Walter continued his streak of passive silence while watching Savannah waste the money I sent home on trivial vanities. I found myself working grueling 80-hour weeks as a cybersecurity engineer, often taking on exhausting freelance consulting gigs just to keep up with their escalating demands for cash. While I lived in a cramped studio apartment eating cheap takeout, Savannah was busy flooding her social media with photos of designer handbags and luxury spa weekends funded entirely by my labor. I distinctly recall calling home to discuss my rising utility bills, only for Martha to interrupt me by saying that Savannah needed a new wardrobe for her social events. My mother had the audacity to tell me that since I was the successful one, it was my inherent duty to ensure my sister didn't feel left behind in society. This toxic narrative turned my career achievements into a source of punishment rather than pride, as every promotion I earned simply meant another excuse for them to ask for more. The situation reached a breaking point when Savannah moved back into the Alexandria house after her third failed business venture left her completely bankrupt and buried in personal debt. Instead of encouraging her to find a job, Martha welcomed her back like a conquering hero and immediately handed over the keys to my Tesla Model S, which I had left there for safekeeping. I arrived home for a rare weekend visit to find Savannah lounging in the driver's seat of my car, complaining that the leather interior wasn't the specific shade of beige she preferred for her aesthetic. When I confronted my parents about this unauthorized use of my property, Martha stood between us and shielded Savannah, while declaring that my sister was the one who truly needed protection from the harsh world. She looked me in the eye with a cold expression and remarked that because I was strong enough to make money, I didn't need the same comforts that Savannah required for her fragile mental health. Walter just nodded along with her words, proving once again that his loyalty lay with maintaining Martha's favor rather than defending his eldest daughter's rights. I felt a profound sense of isolation creeping in as I realized that my presence in their lives had been reduced to a series of digital transfers and banking notifications. My phone would remain silent for weeks at a time until a property tax deadline approached or a major repair was needed for the roof of their expensive suburban home. During one particularly painful dinner, I overheard Martha telling a neighbor that Savannah was the heart of the family, while I was merely the reliable engine that kept things running in the background. That comment stung more than any financial loss because it confirmed that they viewed my humanity as secondary to my utility as a high-income earner. Every time I tried to voice my exhaustion or desire for a break, Martha would manipulate my guilt by reminding me of the roof over their heads that only I could provide. Savannah would just smirk from across the table, knowing that she could continue her reckless spending without ever facing a single consequence for her actions. By the end of that year, I realized that I didn't actually have a family in Alexandria, but rather a group of sophisticated leeches who had memorized my bank account details better than my birthday. I spent my nights staring at my computer screen in a daze, wondering how I had allowed my love for them to be weaponized against my own well-being for so long. The realization that I was just a lucrative entry in their contact list finally began to harden my heart, replacing my habitual guilt with a cold, simmering resentment that would eventually lead to my defiance. I watched Savannah post another photo of herself dining at an expensive steakhouse, while I knew for a fact that my credit card had just been charged for that very meal. The cycle of exploitation had become a well-oiled machine, fueled by Martha's manipulation, Walter's cowardice, and Savannah's bottomless greed. I stood in my quiet apartment miles away, finally understanding that the only way to stop the bleeding was to cut the cord entirely, no matter how much it cost me emotionally. 2 weeks before the official wedding ceremony was set to take place at that extravagant coastal resort, I found myself summoned back to the house under the guise of a family meeting. I initially hoped that perhaps my parents had finally realized the immense pressure I was under, but those illusions were shattered the moment I stepped through the front door. Martha didn't greet me with a hug or even a warm smile. Instead, she immediately handed me a printed invoice for a premium liquor package totaling $12,000. She explained that Savannah had decided to upgrade the open bar at the last minute because her social circle expected nothing less than top-shelf champagne. When I tried to protest that my savings were already depleted from paying the quarterly property taxes, my mother simply waved her hand dismissively, as if the money would just materialize out of thin air. Savannah lounged on the sofa nearby, scrolling through her phone with a bored expression before looking up to deliver a sharp, condescending remark about my presence. She told me that my exhausted appearance and constant talk about budgets were actually threatening to ruin the romantic atmosphere she had worked so hard to cultivate for her big day. The tension in the living room became thick and suffocating as I realized they hadn't invited me home to participate in the joy of the upcoming nuptials. I decided to step out into the hallway to catch my breath, but I accidentally overheard a hushed conversation coming from the kitchen between Savannah and her fiancé, Derek. Derek was leaning against the counter while reviewing some documents that looked suspiciously like the title paperwork for my Tesla. I stood frozen in the shadows as I heard him whispering about how much cash they could secure by selling the car to a private collector before their honeymoon in Bali. Savannah giggled at the suggestion, noting that I was far too preoccupied with my cybersecurity projects to notice the vehicle was missing until they were already halfway across the world. They were planning to liquidate my most valuable asset to fund a vacation they couldn't afford, treating my property as if it were a communal prize for their marriage. I felt a surge of cold fury radiating through my chest as the true depth of their entitlement finally became clear to me in that quiet hallway. I marched into the kitchen to confront them directly about their parasitic plan, demanding that Derek put down the paperwork and leave my house immediately. Savannah didn't even flinch at my anger. Instead, she stood up and adjusted her expensive silk robe while looking at me with pure, unadulterated disdain. She laughed in my face and told me that I should actually be grateful because she was giving me the opportunity to be useful to the family for once in my miserable life. Savannah stepped closer and hissed that I should be honored she let me help since I possessed absolutely no social value other than my ability to provide financial support for people who actually knew how to live. Derek just smirked behind her, leaning back with an arrogant posture that suggested he already considered my hard-earned assets to be his own. The sheer audacity of her statement left me momentarily speechless as I struggled to comprehend how my own sister could view my entire existence as nothing more than a bank account with a pulse. The situation escalated further when Martha stormed into the room, alerted by the raised voices, and immediately took a defensive stance in front of her younger daughter. She pulled a mysterious authorization form from her pocket and demanded that I sign it right then and there, without asking any further questions about the legal implications. When I flatly refused to put my name on another ambiguous document, Martha's face contorted into a mask of pure rage that I had never seen before. She screamed that I was a cold, heartless woman who was trying to sabotage her sister's happiness out of some pathetic, deep-seated jealousy. Before I could even finish explaining my reasons for declining, my mother swung her hand and delivered a stinging slap across my cheek that echoed through the silent kitchen. The physical pain was sharp, but the emotional realization that she would strike me to protect a thief was the final blow to our relationship. Walter stood in the doorway watching the entire scene unfold with his usual cowardice, refusing to intervene, even as his eldest daughter was being assaulted in his own home. I didn't scream or cry in response to the violence. Instead, I simply gathered my belongings and walked toward the front door with a terrifying sense of clarity. As I stepped out into the pouring rain, I felt the heavy weight of years of obligation finally sliding off my shoulders and dissolving into the wet pavement of Alexandria. I sat in my car for a long time watching the raindrops streak across the windshield while I dialed the number for my trusted attorney, Mr. Benson. I told him that the time for mediation had passed and that I needed to begin the process of untangling my life from theirs with surgical precision. The realization that my family bond was officially dead didn't bring me sadness, but rather a profound sense of relief that I was no longer responsible for their greed. I drove away from that house knowing that the next time they heard from me, it would be through a legal representative who wouldn't be swayed by Martha's manipulative tears. 2 days later, the quiet sanctuary of my office was shattered by an urgent encrypted message from my best friend Jordan. As a senior security analyst who often collaborated with me on high-level projects, Jordan possessed the tools to monitor my digital footprint with incredible precision. He informed me that our automated security system had flagged multiple unauthorized login attempts into my sensitive tax and financial records. The most disturbing detail was that these intrusions were traced directly back to the residential IP address of the house in Alexandria. I watched in grim silence as Jordan shared his screen to show me the time-stamped logs of someone systematically digging through my private life while I was busy working. My heart sank as I realized that the people I called family were treating my personal data like a communal resource for their own gain. The investigation deepened quickly as we uncovered a massive business loan for $500,000 that had been finalized just 48 hours prior. My stomach twisted into knots as I reviewed the digital loan application, which had been filed entirely under my legal name and social security number. The documents included a series of sophisticated electronic signatures that mimicked my own handwriting with terrifying accuracy to deceive the bank's verification system. Jordan continued to track the digital breadcrumbs until he discovered that the entire sum had been dispersed into a private offshore account belonging to Derek. It became clear that this wasn't just a simple case of borrowing money without asking, but a coordinated criminal conspiracy to fund Derek's failing business ventures. I stared at the bright blue light of my monitor as the reality of this $500,000 betrayal began to settle into my bones. The most horrifying discovery came when we analyzed the access credentials used to bypass my multi-factor authentication protocols during the initial application phase. We found undeniable evidence that Martha had used her knowledge of my personal security questions to reset my primary banking password from her tablet. My mother had intentionally handed over my entire digital identity to Savannah and Derek so they could facilitate this fraudulent transaction behind my back. She didn't just give them a key to my house, she gave them the power to destroy my financial future before I even had a chance to defend myself. The betrayal felt more visceral than the slap she had delivered just days earlier, because this was a calculated attempt to enslave me to a debt I never agreed to take on. I could almost hear Savannah's laughter in the background as they celebrated their newfound wealth at the expense of my hard-earned reputation. Jordan looked at me through the video call with an expression of deep concern and somber realization about the true nature of my family. He leaned closer to his microphone and told me that Brianna, they are no longer just taking advantage of you, they are actively trying to destroy your life with a financial death sentence that will last for a decade. He urged me to report the fraud to the federal authorities immediately before Derek had a chance to spend the remaining funds on his lavish wedding plans. I appreciated his loyalty, but I knew that a standard police report wouldn't be enough to satisfy the cold fury that was now burning in my chest. I needed them to feel the full weight of their actions at the exact moment they thought they had finally won. My silence wasn't a sign of weakness or submission, but rather the quiet preparation of a digital counterstrike that would leave them with nothing. I spent the next several hours working alongside Jordan to construct a flawless blockade that would prevent any further movement of my assets while keeping the perpetrators in the dark. We set up a series of triggered commands that would activate precisely on the day of Savannah's wedding to ensure maximum impact and public humiliation. I carefully redirected the mortgage payments into a secure escrow account and initiated a formal dispute with the lending institution to freeze the fraudulent loan. Every keystroke felt like a calculated move on a chessboard where I was finally the one in control of the game. I ignored the incoming messages from Martha asking for more money for the floral arrangements, knowing that her world was about to crumble in spectacular fashion. The quiet of my Alexandria apartment was no longer lonely, it was the strategic calm before a storm that would wash away the parasites who had spent years feeding on my soul. 5 days before the grand event was scheduled to commence, I found myself driving through the darkened streets of Alexandria under the cover of midnight. I still possessed a spare key to the family home which I had never returned, allowing me to slip inside the quiet house without alerting anyone to my presence. My heart hammered against my ribs as I crept toward the small home office where Dad usually kept his personal computer unlocked. I needed physical proof of their digital crimes to ensure my legal case was airtight before the wedding festivities reached their peak. After several minutes of searching through buried directories, I discovered a hidden folder containing dozens of high-resolution scans of my official signature. These weren't just random scribbles, they were practice sheets where someone had painstakingly traced my name until the forgery was virtually indistinguishable from my own handwriting. The deeper I dug into the local drive, the more sickening the evidence became, because I eventually stumbled upon a video file dated from the previous month. I clicked play with trembling fingers and watched a recorded clip of Savannah sitting in that very chair laughing hysterically while practicing my signature on the bank's legal disclosure forms. Derek was standing right behind her, cheering her on and pointing out minor inconsistencies in the curves of the letters to help her perfect the fraud. They were treating the destruction of my financial reputation like a competitive game, celebrating each successful forgery with a clink of their wine glasses. Watching my own sister take such visible pleasure in stealing my identity was a level of depravity that I had previously thought was impossible for her. I quickly copied every single incriminating file onto an encrypted flash drive while maintaining a cold, focused silence that masked the turmoil screaming inside my head. The floorboards groaned behind me just as I was finishing the transfer, and I turned around to find Martha standing in the doorway with a look of pure indignation on her face. Instead of showing even a shred of remorse for the criminal evidence displayed on the monitor, she immediately began to scold me for violating their privacy. My mother had the audacity to call me a selfish and ungrateful daughter for daring to investigate the supposed good intentions of Derek and Savannah. She claimed that Derek was only trying to build a stable future for the family, and that my obsessive need for control was the only thing standing in the way of everyone's happiness. Martha crossed her arms and insisted that a loyal daughter would have simply signed whatever they needed without making such a dramatic fuss over a few signatures. It was clear that she had completely detached herself from reality to justify the theft of my life's work for the sake of her favorite child. I stood my ground while the light from the computer screen illuminated the betrayal etched into her features, realizing that Martha had actively encouraged Derek's greed from the start. I discovered a saved email draft where my mother had explicitly promised Derek that I would never discover the loan because I was too busy earning money to check my own statements. She had traded my security for Savannah's vanity without a second thought, effectively selling me out to a man who viewed me as nothing more than a resource to be mined. When Martha tried to snatch the flash drive from my hand, I stepped back and looked at her with a level of detachment that seemed to finally rattle her composure. I told her with a voice as cold as the winter air that she had officially chosen Savannah over me, so she should spend the next few days hoping Savannah has the strength to save her when the inevitable storm finally makes landfall. The silence that followed my statement was heavy and final, marking the ultimate death of any lingering familial affection I might have still carried for that woman. I walked past her without another word, ignoring her desperate demands to know what I was planning to do with the information I had stolen. I spent the remainder of the night in my own apartment meticulously assembling the legal documents that would eventually bring their house of cards crashing down. I drafted a formal request to the lending institution to immediately terminate all loan guarantees associated with the Alexandria property due to the documented fraud I had uncovered. By the time the sun began to rise over the Potomac River, I had successfully submitted the evidence to both the bank and my attorney, Mr. Benson. The trap was now fully set, and all that remained was for the calendar to turn toward the day when Savannah expected to walk down the aisle in triumph. That weekend, the wedding ceremony officially began at the luxury resort, while I sat comfortably in my quiet apartment. I watched Savannah appear on the high-definition livestream, looking radiant in the designer gown that I had essentially funded through my years of toil. Just as the music reached a crescendo, a final notification from the group chat popped up on my phone screen containing her cruel message. Savannah had explicitly stated once again that I was banned from the venue because her amazing wedding was reserved only for real family members. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me because I knew that her moment of triumph was about to be short-lived. I waited with surgical precision for the exact second they were preparing to exchange their vows before initiating the digital counterstrike I had prepared. With a single tap on my laptop, I activated the remote security override to permanently lock the Tesla Model S parked at the resort entrance. Simultaneously, I sent the authorization to the bank to flag all associated credit cards as stolen, effectively freezing the payment for the entire event. The scene on the live stream quickly devolved into absolute chaos as the resort manager approached the altar with an urgent expression on his face. The music abruptly cut out, replaced by the hushed whispers of confused guests as they realized something was terribly wrong with the arrangements. The manager informed Savannah and Derek that their primary payment method had been declined and that an immediate settlement of $60,000 was required. Savannah's face contorted from a forced smile of joy into a mask of pure panic as she realized her access to my funds had been severed. Guests began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, while the beautiful floral backdrop seemed to mock the financial ruin unfolding in real time. I watched as Derek tried to argue with the staff, but his arrogance quickly faded when he realized he had no backup plan for his stolen wealth. The luxury wedding they had built on a foundation of lies was collapsing under the weight of their own criminal entitlement. My phone began to vibrate violently against the wooden desk as Savannah finally realized who was behind the sudden collapse of her perfect day. I decided to answer the call, hearing her voice trembling with a mixture of hysterical rage and desperate confusion over the line. Savannah screamed into the receiver, demanding to know what the hell I was doing and accusing me of trying to kill her happiness on her most important day. I leaned back in my chair and took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea before answering her in a voice that was perfectly composed. I told her that her happiness was built entirely on a foundation of theft, and now it was time for her to return everything she had taken from me. I reminded her that the car she planned to use for her grand exit was now a useless piece of metal locked at the front gate. Savannah let out a strangled cry of frustration before I calmly ended the call, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions without my support. The silence in my room was a stark contrast to the storm of incoming calls from Martha and Walter that began to flood my notification bar. My mother left a series of increasingly frantic voicemakers alternating between sobbing apologies and venomous insults about my lack of family loyalty. Martha begged me to reconsider for the sake of their reputation in Alexandria, claiming that I was destroying the family's honor over a simple misunderstanding. Walter's name appeared on the screen as well, but I knew he was only calling because Martha had instructed him to fix the mess he helped create. I watched the missed call count climb toward 60 yet. I felt absolutely no obligation to answer or offer them a single cent of relief. They had spent years treating me like a disposable resource, and now they were finally experiencing the reality of a life without my constant financial intervention. I simply smiled at the screen, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere of my home, while the parasites scrambled to find a way out of the hole they had dug. The live stream eventually went dark as the resort staff began to clear the guests away from the main hall due to the lack of payment. I could only imagine the humiliation Savannah felt as she had to explain to her social circle why the bar was closed and the dinner was canceled. Derek was likely realizing that his offshore account was now under investigation, leaving him with no way to escape the legal trap I had meticulously set. Every moment of my previous exhaustion was vindicated by the sight of their house of cards tumbling into the ocean. I felt a profound sense of closure knowing that I had finally stood up for myself against the people who were supposed to love me most. The night was still young, but for the first time in a decade, I was the one who controlled the narrative of my own life. I turned off my computer and allowed the darkness of the room to envelop me, feeling lighter than I had since the day I signed that first mortgage. One day after the catastrophic failure of the wedding ceremony, the heavy oak doors of Mr. Benson's law office swung open to reveal the entire Sterling family marching toward me with aggressive expressions. Savannah led the charge with her face still blotched from crying, while Derek trailed behind her with his fists clenched, as if he intended to physically intimidate me into submission. Their momentum came to a grinding halt the moment they realized that I wasn't sitting alone, but was flanked by my attorney and two uniformed officers from the Alexandria Police Department. The fierce indignation on Martha's face instantly dissolved into a flicker of genuine fear as she noticed the recording devices and legal folders spread across the mahogany conference table. I sat perfectly still watching the color drain from Savannah's cheeks as she processed the fact that this was no longer a private family squabble, but a formal criminal investigation. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic tapping of Mr. Benson's pen against his notepad. I wasted no time in laying out the physical evidence of their betrayal, opening the folder to display the high-resolution practice sheets of my forged signatures and the records of the $500,000 loan. Savannah and Derek stared at the documents in stunned silence, while Derek's arrogant posture completely collapsed as he realized the digital breadcrumbs had led us directly to his offshore account. Martha tried to stammer out a weak defense about family unity, but her voice failed her when Mr. Benson played the video recording of Savannah laughing while practicing my handwriting. The evidence of identity theft was so overwhelming that even Walter seemed to shrink in his chair, finally realizing that his silence had allowed his family to cross into serious criminal territory. I looked directly at Savannah, whose eyes were darting around the room, looking for a way to escape the legal trap that was now closing tightly around her. As the gravity of the situation became undeniable, Martha suddenly dropped to her knees on the expensive carpet and began to sob hysterically while clutching at my sleeve for mercy. She begged me to withdraw the charges because Savannah was supposedly pregnant, and a criminal record would destroy the future of her unborn grandchild. I looked down at her with a detached sense of pity, because I could still see the same manipulative glimmer in her eyes that had been there for my entire childhood. Savannah joined in the desperate performance, claiming that Derek had only forced her to help him because they were so deeply in love and wanted to build a legacy for their new family. I pulled my arm away from Martha's grip, realizing that even at the brink of destruction, they were still trying to use emotional blackmail to evade the consequences of their greed. Walter finally found his voice after years of cowardly submission, but instead of apologizing for the theft of my identity, he only spoke to beg me to save the house in Alexandria. He pleaded with me to pay the arrears and maintain the mortgage because he and Martha had nowhere else to go and were far too old to start over in a rented apartment. His plea was the final confirmation that they still viewed me as nothing more than a financial safety net rather than a daughter with her own life and feelings. I stood up from my chair and looked at the four of them with a cold, unwavering clarity that silenced their pathetic wailing for a brief moment. I told them with absolute finality that they had officially deleted my name from the family, so I was now officially deleting my name from every single one of their bills and fraudulent debts. The atmosphere in the office turned frigid as I turned to the officers and signaled for them to proceed with the formal statements regarding the identity theft and financial fraud. I watched with a strange sense of relief as the police officers stepped forward to inform Derek and Savannah that they needed to come down to the precinct for questioning. Martha screamed that I was a monster who was tearing the family apart, but her words no longer had the power to sting or make me feel the slightest bit of guilt. I stood by the window and watched as they were led out of the building, realizing that the empire of lies they had built was finally being dismantled by the very truth they had tried to bury. The cycle of exploitation was finally over, and for the first time in my life, I was standing on solid ground that belonged entirely to me. 3 months later, the bite of a genuine Virginia winter finally arrived to settle over the barren remains of my former life in Alexandria. The grand house that I had protected with my own credit for so many years was eventually foreclosed upon after the bank processed the fraud reports. Martha and Walter were forced to pack their remaining belongings into a handful of cardboard boxes before moving into a dilapidated 2-bedroom apartment on the bleak outskirts of the city. Their credit scores were so utterly decimated that no reputable landlord would even consider their application without an exorbitant security deposit they could barely afford. Savannah was now working long, grueling shifts as a server at a local greasy spoon diner to fulfill her court-ordered civil restitution payments. Derek avoided immediate prison time but now faced a permanent criminal record and a 10-year suspended sentence that effectively ended his dreams of ever working in finance again. The arrogance they once wore like a designer cloak had been replaced by the cold, hard reality of struggling to survive on a meager, honest income. I spent those early winter weeks finalizing the sale of my Tesla and reclaiming every cent of the savings I had managed to scrape together during the investigation. The process of untangling my finances was tedious, yet each cleared transaction felt like a heavy chain being lifted from my weary soul. I made the conscious decision to delete every single relative's phone number from my contacts, finally severing the digital tethers that had allowed them to bleed me dry. I discovered that the silence of my new empty apartment was not a sign of loneliness, but rather the sweet melody of a peace I had never been allowed to experience. The occasional pang of guilt for leaving them to their fate was quickly silenced by the memory of the $500,000 debt they had tried to anchor to my name. I realized that choosing my own survival over their parasitic comfort was the most honest and courageous act of my entire 32 years on this earth. The morning of my departure from Virginia arrived with a crisp, clear sky that seemed to mirror the newfound clarity within my own mind. I stood in the center of the bustling airport terminal, holding nothing but a single suitcase and a one-way ticket to a city where nobody knew my name or my history as a family ATM. There was no desperate phone call from Martha to stop me, and no snide remark from Savannah to diminish my excitement for the future. I looked at my reflection in the glass window of the terminal and saw a woman who was no longer defined by her utility to others, but by her own independent strength. Brianna was no longer a resource to be mined or a safety net to be stretched thin by the hands of people who claimed to love her. As the gate agent announced the final boarding call, I felt a profound sense of lightness that told me I was finally heading toward a life that was truly mine. I walked onto that plane without a single look back at the ruins I had left behind, knowing that the most expensive thing I ever bought was the freedom to never be their victim again. This story serves as a stark warning about the absolute necessity of establishing firm financial boundaries, even with those you hold closest to your heart. You must never allow a blind sense of familial love to transform you into a convenient tool for the unchecked greed or selfishness of others. True forgiveness can only exist when it is not accompanied by the continued sacrifice of your own well-being and personal safety. Protecting yourself from exploitation is not an act of betrayal, but an essential requirement for a life of dignity. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very final moments of this intense journey toward reclaiming justice and personal peace. I truly appreciate every single person who has supported this story with their time and attention. Now I want to hear from you, so if you found yourself in Brianna's difficult position, would you remain silent to keep the peace, or stand up to expose the truth? Please share your honest thoughts and perspectives in the comments section below.